This is the portrait of a little girl named Nora Elwood, taken in the early 1920s. It looks ordinary enough. A 5-year-old in a plain white dress, sitting stiffly for the camera, her hands folded neatly in her lap. But if you stare long enough into her eyes, something unsettling stirs there, something far too old for a child. What the camera captured that day was not innocence but the beginning of one of the strangest stories ever told. Because soon after this photograph was taken, Nora suffered a fall that would change everything. It happened on a cold spring morning inside her family's London home. Nora had been running down the staircase when her foot slipped on the polished wood. She tumbled hard, her head striking the landing with a dull crack. Servants rushed to her aid, her mother screamed for help, and for hours a doctor worked anxiously over her tiny, still body. They thought she would not wake, but when she finally stirred that evening, her first words were not the voice of a frightened child. They were strange, rasping syllables, foreign, ancient, sounds that no one in the room understood. Only much later would scholars recognize them as Egyptian, a language dead for over 2,000 years. And then, clear and certain, Nora said, "I am Tia." Her parents were horrified. Her father demanded she stop speaking such nonsense. But her mother, shaken by the conviction in her daughter's eyes, began keeping quiet notes of what the child said. Because Nora didn't simply claim to be someone else, she claimed to remember another life. She told them she was Tia, chantress and scribe of Ramses II. She spoke of singing hymns in stone halls at dawn, of copying sacred decrees on papyrus, of bowing in the presence of the pharaoh himself. She was only 5, yet she spoke with the calm assurance of an adult recalling familiar duties. At first, her family dismissed it as imagination, but soon there were things they could not explain. One afternoon, just weeks after her accident, Nora startled her governess by filling sheets of paper with strange symbols. The woman thought them childish doodles until a visiting scholar happened to glance at them. He froze. "These aren't scribbles," he whispered. "They're hieroglyphs, and not just random shapes. Real inscriptions, copied with uncanny precision by a child who had never so much as seen an Egyptian artifact." As she grew, her memories deepened. At night, she hummed melodies in her sleep. Strange, wavering tones that her mother later discovered matched transcriptions of ancient temple hymns. She described details no schoolbook contained: the sharp scent of burning myrrh, the way the sun cut across colossal statues only on equinox, the cold hush of sanctuaries that opened but once a year. By the age of 9, she had begun astonishing outsiders. Shown a photograph of the temple of Abu Simbel, she pointed without hesitation, "I walked there, I wrote there, this is where Ramses stood." None of the assembled guests could explain how a child in England could identify a temple in southern Egypt she had never seen or read about. A few years later, she was handed an inscription, recently unearthed, one no textbook had published. Without hesitation, she read it aloud, then corrected the scholar's translation. "It is not light," she said, her small finger resting on the carved sign. "It is life." Ramses spoke of life everlasting. Whispers spread. Some called her a prodigy, others a fraud, others still a soul possessed. But Nora herself was always calm, always unshaken. "I am Tia," she would say. "I was chantress and scribe. In the house of life, my pharaoh was Ramses." By the end of the decade, the photograph of that little girl in white was no longer just a family keepsake. It circulated quietly among researchers and skeptics who leaned close to study her steady gaze. Some swore her eyes belonged not to a child, but to someone who had seen too much. And so, the story of Nora Elwood Tia, the girl who claimed to return 3 millennia after her death, was only just beginning. By the time Nora turned 12, the household had grown used to her strangeness, but never comfortable with it. There was something in the way she carried herself, calm, deliberate, as though she were listening to echoes only she could hear. She was no longer just the child who had tumbled down the stairs. She was Tia, and she seemed to know things no living person should. At meals, she sometimes paused, with her spoon halfway to her lips, and whispered, "This bread tastes wrong. Ours was sweetened with honey and dates." Her mother would go pale, pushing her own plate away, while her father slammed his hand against the table and told her to stop. But Nora never looked embarrassed. She only blinked slowly, as though waking from a memory that was more vivid than the present. Her notebooks were filling faster than her mother could tuck them away. Symbols poured from her pen rows of falcons, suns, rivers, and ankhs. Some pages were covered in what looked like hymns, long lines of looping characters broken with marks that seemed to guide rhythm or pitch. Once, her governess overheard her humming as she wrote. It was a melody so low and mournful that it seemed to vibrate in the very walls. When asked what the song was, Nora did not hesitate. "It is for the rising of Ra. We sang it as the sun entered the hall." One evening, a local schoolmaster visited the Elwood home. Curious about the rumors, he brought with him a rubbing of hieroglyphs taken from a tomb wall. He set it before Nora with a half smile, expecting childish guesses. Instead, she leaned over it, tracing the symbols with her finger as though reacquainting herself with an old friend. "It speaks of the pharaoh's father," she said simply. "It says he offers bread and breath." The schoolmaster frowned. "That cannot be right. The text begins with light." Nora's eyes flashed. "No, you have copied it upside down." The room went quiet. Later, the man would admit she had been correct. Her mother grew protective, hiding Nora's writings from visitors. But secrets have a way of slipping out. Whispers spread through the neighborhood of a child who sang in dead tongues of drawings that matched ruins in deserts she had never seen. Some whispered of reincarnation, others of madness. A few muttered of darker things, possession, curses, the devil's work. Nora herself never flinched at the gossip. If anything, she seemed to grow more serene with every accusation. "I am only remembering," she said one night as her mother tucked her into bed. "That is all memory is, work carried over. We are never finished, not even when we die." Her mother shivered at the calm certainty in her daughter's voice. By her mid-teens, Nora had begun to describe entire rituals. She spoke of early mornings in shadowed courts, when chantresses lifted their voices as priests poured libations on the stone floors. She described the way the air would shimmer with incense smoke, how the sun would slide across the polished limestone, illuminating statues of gods hidden until that exact moment of the year. She even described her own role, singing the hymns, copying records, sharpening reed pens with flint knives. She recalled dipping them into ink, her hands smudged with ochre and carbon. "My fingers always ached," she said once, rubbing her palm absent-mindedly, as though still feeling the sting of work done 3,000 years ago. When she told these stories, she was not the Nora Elwood her family knew. Her posture shifted, her tone deepened, her eyes seemed to fix on something distant. It was as though she was slipping backward in time, stepping through a doorway invisible to everyone else. But the most unsettling moments were her dreams. She began waking in the middle of the night, her sheets damp with sweat, her voice hoarse from chanting. She told of long corridors sloping into darkness, of chambers filled with scrolls, of hidden doorways sealed with stone. She would describe them in detail, the next morning sketching the angles, the shapes of the lintels, even the markings on the walls. At first, her mother dismissed them as nightmares, but when a visiting Egyptologist compared her drawings to newly published surveys, he grew pale. "These details," he said quietly, "they are not in books. How could she know of these?" No one had an answer. Nora herself seemed less concerned with the questions than with the memories. She began to speak of a growing pull, something calling her eastward toward the land she claimed as her own. "I can feel the desert," she whispered once to her mother. "The wind, the sand, it waits for me." She was no longer satisfied with books or sketches. She wanted to return to stand among the temples again. And as her voice grew stronger, so did the unease of those around her, because Nora Elwood was no longer just a girl with strange talents. She was becoming something else, something caught between two lives. And the further she stepped into her memories, the more it seemed the past was preparing to reclaim her. By the time Nora reached her late teens, her dreams had hardened into something more than visions. They were maps, fragmented, shifting but insistent. She could no longer keep them to herself. Night after night, she sketched what she saw. Sloping tunnels cut into bedrock, chambers lined with columns, stairways swallowed by sand. Her drawings filled entire journals. One evening, her mother found her hunched over a candle, shading the outline of a massive doorway. Across the top, she had drawn a row of cobras, their hoods flared. "This isn't just a dream," Nora whispered, pressing her charcoal into the paper until her fingers smudged black. "I remember walking through here. The air was so cold, colder than the desert above." Her mother touched the paper, shivering at the certainty. In her daughter's voice, word of Nora's sketches reached scholars again, though her father fought to keep them away. Eventually, one persistent Egyptologist persuaded the family to let him see them. He spread the pages out across a table, his eyes narrowing as he examined the lines. "This shaft," he said, pointing at one drawing. "How did you know it bends?" Nora looked at him as though insulted. Because I walked it. The torchlight made the walls glow red. There is a chamber at the end, but it was sealed. The man blinked. Only weeks earlier, his team had identified just such a bent passage inside a minor pyramid, an unusual architectural feature known to no one outside the dig. He left the Elwood house that night, pale and shaken. By 19, Nora was no longer satisfied with England. The pull toward Egypt gnawed at her constantly. "It isn't a place to me," she told her mother quietly. "It's a return." When she finally set foot on Egyptian soil, the change was immediate. The desert air seemed to lift her, and her composure deepened into something almost regal. She walked through temples with an unerring confidence, as though reacquainting herself with familiar halls. At Abydos, she paused before a wall of faded carvings and whispered, "This is wrong. These stones were moved." Guides exchanged nervous glances. Because she was right, archaeologists had quietly recorded the displacement years earlier. At Karnak, she recited hymns. Before inscriptions tourists couldn't even read, her voice carrying an eerie resonance through the towering columns. Local workers began to call her El Bint El Pharaoun, the pharaoh's daughter. But it was at the pyramids where her visions sharpened most dangerously. She would stand in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, her hands pressed against the stone, murmuring in a tongue that had not been spoken for millennia. Then she would point. "There is a hollow space here. There is a passage. Beneath this block, there is a chamber that was never meant for burial." Engineers scoffed at first, but when they tested some of her claims, with soundings and ground measurements, they discovered voids, exactly where she said they would be. She knew of architectural features science had not yet confirmed. One night, under the light of an oil lamp in her modest Cairo room, she traced an entire network of hidden paths on a sheet of parchment. Her hand moved quickly, almost feverishly, as though the memory were pouring out faster than she could control. When she finished, she collapsed, pale and trembling. "It isn't finished," she whispered. "The deepest chambers are still waiting." By now, she had drawn the attention of more than just scholars. Some feared her knowledge, calling her a danger to the sanctity of the past. Others wanted to use her insights, pressing her to guide digs to prove once and for all whether she was a fraud or a miracle. Nora, calm as always, brushed their questions aside. "I am not discovering anything," she said softly. "I am remembering." And the more she remembered, the less she seemed to belong to the present. She wandered the ruins in a trance, murmuring names long forgotten, tracing hieroglyphs with her fingertips as though greeting old friends. She began to speak less of herself as Nora, more as Tia Ramses' chantress and scribe. Her journals now contained not just maps but warnings. "These chambers are not for the dead," she wrote in one. "They are for the living, for what must be preserved until the right time." Another entry read, "The House of Life was never only a library, it was a vault. Beneath stone, knowledge waits, knowledge that could wound the unready." To those who read her notes, it sounded like riddles. To Nora, it was memory resurfacing. And as she pressed deeper into her past life, the lines between memory and prophecy blurred. Her discoveries were no longer just validations of what had been lost. They were guiding researchers toward what had not yet been revealed. The maps in her notebooks had begun leading not to questions, but to answers. And answers, as history has shown, can be more dangerous than secrets. By the time Nora Elwood reached her 20s, she no longer moved. Through Egypt like a visitor, she walked, as if she belonged to it, as if every block of sandstone, every inscription carved in shadowed halls acknowledged her presence. The scholars who once debated whether she was a fraud began to fall silent in her company. There was something unnerving about the way she carried herself, not as a curious young woman, but as one returning to her rightful place, and in her presence, Egypt itself seemed to stir. On a blazing afternoon at Luxor, Nora stopped mid-stride and pressed her hand against a wall, darkened by centuries of soot. "There was a chant here," she murmured, her voice low but steady. Then, without hesitation, she began to sing. The notes rose and fell in a cadence so ancient, so haunting, that the local workers froze in place. They swore afterward that the air thickened, that the columns themselves seemed to vibrate with her song. To Nora, it was not performance, it was duty. "We sang here at dawn," she whispered when she finished, her eyes glistening. "When the light broke through the sanctuary doors, we called the sun to rise." The workers crossed themselves, the scholars scribbled in silence. But deep down, all of them knew she had sung, as one who remembered, not one who guessed. Her transformation grew bolder with each passing year. The name Nora slipped from her lips less often. Tia, she introduced herself now, not as a claim, but as a certainty. She began dressing in long white robes when she visited the ruins, her dark hair braided like the reliefs on temple walls. Locals started leaving, offerings of flowers in her path, whispering that the chantress of Ramses had returned to guard what had been lost. She didn't correct them. And then she began to guard. At one excavation near Saqqara, a team of researchers prepared to unseal a shaft, rumored to lead to a burial chamber. But Nora's journals had warned, not all doors are meant to be opened. She arrived uninvited, stepping down into the dust as the team readied their tools. "Stop," she said, her voice carrying with unnatural force in the narrow shaft. The men laughed uneasily. "It's only stone," one muttered. Nora's gaze hardened. "It is not only stone, it was sealed with words of power. If you break them carelessly, the knowledge inside will burn you." The laughter faltered, and though they mocked her later, none of the men lifted a chisel that day. Within weeks, the shaft collapsed in a storm, its entrance swallowed by sand. Some called it coincidence, others remembered the strange certainty in Nora's voice. Her warnings began to feel less like riddles and more like commands. She scrawled notes into her journals at night. "The pharaoh's voice must not be silenced. The house of life is not only memory, it is defense." Some nights she woke trembling, speaking of guardians carved, not in flesh but in stone, their forms waiting in hidden halls to protect what Ramses had sealed away. And then there were the visions. One evening in Cairo, Nora collapsed mid-sentence while speaking to a group of scholars. When she woke, her eyes were glassy, her voice low. "The chambers are awake," she whispered. "The seals weaken. They call for their guardian." From then on, it was as if she lived, with one foot in the present and one in the reign of Ramses II. At times, she spoke of herself, as though she were both Nora and Tia, a girl reborn to carry a burden across centuries. Her friends begged her to rest, but she only shook her head. "I was not brought back to rest, I was brought back to guard." And still, her maps grew. The drawings she produced now were more detailed, almost architectural blueprints of corridors and secret vaults. She spoke of hidden libraries, beneath the sands where stone tablets carried knowledge of medicine, astronomy, and even forces that sounded more like modern science than ancient magic. "They kept it all," she whispered once, clutching her notebook. "They wrote it for the future, for those who could understand, but it must not fall into the wrong hands." Whispers spread, faster than her notebooks could be hidden. Some saw her as a prophet, others as a madwoman. But there was one truth none could deny. Wherever she went, discoveries followed. Walls shifted where she predicted, voids appeared. Where she traced her finger, chambers revealed themselves as if answering her call. It was no longer possible to dismiss her as coincidence. And so the question darkened over everyone. Who watched her if she truly was Tia Chantress? And scribe of Ramses II, then why had she returned after 3,000 years? The answer, it seemed, was unfolding before their eyes, because Nora Elwood, or Tia, was no longer simply remembering, she was reclaiming her role. She was the guardian, returned. Nora's presence in Egypt had grown so unsettling that even seasoned archaeologists began to avoid speaking her name aloud. By then, she answered only to Tia, as though Nora Elwood had been nothing but a temporary mask. And then one morning she was gone. Her cot was empty, her journals missing, only a single page lay pinned beneath a stone in her tent, marked with a line in hieroglyphs that none present could translate. That very day, workers at a pyramid site made a discovery that would leave scholars shaken for decades. At the far end of the newly uncovered shaft, two hidden passages emerged, each sealed behind limestone blocks. When the first was breached, the air that escaped was stale, heavy with resin. Inside, the men found a chamber lined with niches for sarcophagi, yet the stone surfaces bore fresh drag marks. The chamber had been opened recently. The mummies that should have been there had been removed. Only days before, the second passage led to something stranger. A low chamber opened into a wide room, its walls lined with empty recesses. Scattered across the floor lay fragments of shattered shelves, a few broken tablets, and dust where rows of knowledge had once stood. In one corner, however, a bundle of intact stone tablets remained, overlooked or left behind. When researchers carried them into the light, they froze. The carvings were not merely funerary prayers or hymns to gods. They were precise sequences, a disturbing fusion of ritual and calculation, instructions for mixtures of resins and salts, diagrams of human anatomy, notes on the restoration of flesh. One inscription ended with chilling clarity: "To preserve is to delay, to awaken is to triumph." The tablet spoke of the process, far beyond embalming, something closer to resurrection. For weeks, teams studied them in secrecy. The more they read, the clearer it became. This chamber had once been a library, filled with hundreds of such texts. Yet nearly all had been removed on the same day the mummies were taken. And the timing was no coincidence. The journals left in Nora's tent hinted at the passages at the Chamber of Guardians and the Room of Voices. She had drawn the very niches where the missing mummies once lay, and her last words to her companions echoed now like a warning. The House of Life is not only memory, it is defense. The scholars whispered what none wanted to say aloud. Nora, or Tia, had known of these places before anyone else. She had vanished the same night. The chambers were emptied, and the knowledge missing from those shelves was now in her possession. The official reports dismissed it, of course. The papers noted only ancient storage rooms of limited importance. But in Cairo's private circles, rumors spread like wildfire that Nora had not disappeared into the desert, but into the chambers themselves, that she had taken the tablets with her, that she sought not to preserve history, but to revive it, and the most unsettling rumor of all, that the mummies removed from their resting places were not taken by looters or rival diggers, but by Nora herself, Tia, the Chantress who had returned, after 3,000 years, to guard Ramses' secrets. If that was true, then she had not guarded them, she had claimed them. No one ever saw her again. All that remained was the photograph of the small girl in white taken in 1921. Scholars still pass it quietly, from hand to hand, staring into the steady eyes of the child who grew into Tia. Some insist the eyes belong to a child of London. Others swear they belong to a woman who once sang hymns before Ramses II. But one question silences every room. Where her story is told, if Nora Elwood vanished with the knowledge to bring the dead to life, then what exactly is she planning to return with?